There we go. So now we are recording. You probably got a little pop-up. Welcome to those of you who are joining us now on YouTube as well. So my name is Jamie Vibach, and I am the Will County Director for the Conservation Foundation. Just so you know, everyone is muted. Your cameras are off. This is a webinar format, so you can see us, but we can't see you. And as I mentioned, this webinar is going to be recorded, so everybody can enjoy it later. If there's something you miss, check out our YouTube channel. It'll be posted there. I usually get it up within a couple of hours. So if you have a question, please use the Q&A box. That lets everybody see your question. It also makes it easier for me to find them all. Sometimes they can get lost in chat. We've got a big group today, so sometimes the questions can get lost if there's lots of people commenting things in the chat. So if you have a question, use the Q&A box. That's the easiest way for me to find them. We will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. For your safety, you should only be able to post or see what I post in the chat, but just in case I missed a setting, don't click any links other than what I might post in there. These webinars are offered free to the public, but we do encourage you to consider a donation or a membership. The more people we have attending these webinars, the more it does cost us to run them. So at the end of the webinar, you're going to be taken to a page with a bunch of resources and things that you might be interested in. Native plant guides, rain garden guides, things like that. But our virtual tip jar is also there. So if you're enjoying these webinars, I do encourage you to donate. That just helps to keep us running. And it also makes you a member. There's a little checkbox there. So if you become a member, you get to also enjoy our wide variety of members only stuff. As we know, we are doing a new day for our webinar series now. So Wednesday, next week, on Wednesday, August 19th, we will have Recycling Confusion. Let's sort it out with our guest host, Marta Keene from Will County Land Use. So she's gonna be helping us figure out all the confusion surrounding recycling, what can be recycled, what can't, how it works, all that kind of good stuff. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Denis Kania, who has all kinds of birding credentials and has traveled extensively looking for birds and is going to talk to us today about hummingbirds.
Well, hi everyone. Really great to be here. Jamie, thanks a lot for inviting me to speak today. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to have a riot, so I hope you guys enjoy it as well. So let me tell you just a little bit about myself. I have been birding for probably about 35 years now. I started late in life. Most hotshot birders will start when they haven't even seen their 10th birthday yet. So for me, I started quite a bit later than that, and it was kind of by accident, but I really dove into it and I'm really enjoying it in many different ways now. So one of the things that I like to do is to focus on education, and I've been teaching at the Morton Arboretum for 23 years now. And a lot of the materials that I utilize in those classes, I've been actually putting in a kind of a tutorial format for Zoom recordings, and so people can watch them at any time. I do a lot of international traveling. The hummingbirds are my favorite bird group in the world, and so for me to see more hummingbirds, I have to travel pretty far, since here in Illinois we just have basically one regularly occurring hummingbird species. So so if I want to see more hummingbirds, I have to go far, far away generally. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint that I put together. So we're going to launch that here. Take me just a second. And so I'm going to move the screen up here a little bit. So I'm actually representing the DuPage Birding Club today. I'm their current president, and the DuPage Birding Club is a very active club in DuPage County and beyond, I suppose. We have a very large membership. It's been a little bit interesting this year with COVID-19 being around, but it helped us or stimulated us to be a little bit more creative. And so we've been doing some things since we can't have field trips. So we just recently started back up with field trips. We haven't been able to have meetings. We just held our first virtual meeting, and it was on hummingbirds, a different program than the one you're going to see today. But what we started doing was we created our own education channel. And so every Wednesday we post a different tutorial on there, and they're usually anywhere from 7 to 15 minutes long, something like that. And they'll cover various bird topics on ID questions or just how to improve your birding skills. So there's a lot of interesting topics there. We've also introduced a hotspot page on our website. And so you can go to that and you can actually, have enough information to do your own field trip. You don't have to attend one of ours. You can go to any one of our forest preserves or other special places in the county and do your own birding that way. So if you're interested in any more information on any of that, and all of you that are from out of state, if you want to come visit us sometime, we really have a lot of great birds here to see. You can visit us at dupagebirding.org. That's our homepage. And from that homepage, you'll be able to find all those hotspots. You'll be able to find the link to our YouTube channel as well. So our main topic for today is going to be attracting hummingbirds to your yard. And as I mentioned before, this is my favorite bird family. It's a very large bird family. It's the second largest in the world. There's roughly 350 species in the world now. That number keeps changing because with DNA research, they're finding more and more splits that they can create. So the number of hummingbirds keeps growing, and the goalpost for me as far as trying to find all the hummingbirds in the world keeps getting moved down the field a bit as that number grows. So here are the things that we're going to try and cover today. We're going to talk about our attraction to hummingbirds and why we appreciate them so much. We're going to take a world perspective for just a short amount of time so that you can kind of get a feel for where our hummingbird fits in with the rest of the world. And we will talk about that Midwestern hummingbird that's most likely to show up in your backyard. We'll talk about how to attract hummingbirds to your backyard, the food sources that hummingbirds enjoy, some of their favorite plant species, mixing your own hummingbird nectar, cleaning your hummingbird feeder, which is extremely important, hummingbird mortality, and then we'll actually talk about a little bit about ruby-throated hummingbirds, courtship and nesting. So you can see that already there's an international flair here. When I was preparing this program, someone sent me an email and was asking me questions about this particular hummingbird. And it turns out it's a sapphire-spangled emerald, and that is a hummingbird that you would find down in Argentina. But it just was handy, so I popped it in here. So this next slide kind of gives us a little perspective on just how long people have admired hummingbirds. And so we have a very rudimentary carving here in stone, and this is, archaeologists say that this is actually a hummingbird. So hard for me to tell. I don't have this species on my list, I don't think, but it is an interesting looking carving. And so I don't have any date for that, but here's the famous Nazca lines that are found in Peru. And I've not had the pleasure of flying over those to get a good bird's eye view of these. But this is something that dates back to probably in the range of 700 BC to 700 AD. So it's, a long, long time ago, people were already admiring hummingbirds. This next image here is actually of some petroglyphs that are found here in North America. And when I was putting this program together quite a few years ago, I wanted to include this petroglyph. I thought it was very interesting. Well, on a trip just a few years ago to New Mexico, I was visiting Petroglyph National Monument, which is just outside of Albuquerque. And I actually found this exact image. So this is now my photograph that I took of this petroglyph. We got some other pretty fancy looking things down here. Here's some really nice pottery, and you can see that hummingbirds are featured in that. This is the drum head of an Inuit drum from up in Alaska. And you might make an argument that these are kingfishers, but I do believe that to me they look like they're hummingbirds, so we're going to go with that. And then here's a crimson topaz tattoo on somebody's shoulder. So we find many, many ways to appreciate hummingbirds, and as you can see, it goes way back in time that people had a very great admiration for these birds. They're just so fascinating because I think a lot of it has to do with the coloration that they have. A lot of it has to do with that sparkling iridescence that many of them have. And the fact that they can move in such unusual ways. They're not like any other bird in the world. You have, hummingbirds with the ability to completely hover in midair. They can fly backwards. They can even fly upside down. So quite remarkable. So here's a few pictures that I've taken on some of my travels. Most of these are from Colombia or from Ecuador. And this one up here is not mine. It's a friend of mine who's traveling with me, and this picture is actually from Brazil. But the rest I think are from Colombia and Ecuador. And I have this slide up here just so you can get an understanding of just how much we do revere hummingbirds. If you look at the names of these things, you'll see that they all are they're names that are supposed to represent some kind of stature of excellence, Empress Brilliant, and a velvet purple coronet, star frontlet. You'll find many different hummingbird species with the word star in their names. Sparkling violet ear, crowned wood nymph. So just many, many different names. And just this is just a small smidgen of the names that you might actually run across. So there's a lot of things like shining sunbeam, sun angel. It just goes on and on. Comets. A lot of the gemstones are represented. So we do have things like sapphires and emeralds and rubies, things like that. So obviously we think of these as being pretty cool creatures. So I wanted to give you that little perspective on just where we are in the hummingbird world. So here's a map of the two continents that make up the Western Hemisphere. And so right off the bat, that leads to a question of, how come I don't have Africa and Europe and Asia and Australia shown on this map? Well, it turns out that hummingbirds today are only found in these two continents. The rest of the world is missing out on them. There are other birds that fill that niche that hummingbirds do. When you go to some of these other places in Africa or Australia or Southeast Asia, and they're called sunbirds. They do have similar plumages. They do have some of that iridescence that we see in our hummingbirds. They have curved bills that are utilized in going after nectar. So they have a lot of similarities, but the one thing that they cannot do is hover like our hummingbirds do. So the very center of the hummingbird universe is right here in Ecuador. And this is a very small country. It's only about the size of Colorado, yet it has over 160 hummingbird species residing there. And its neighbors, if you look at Colombia and Peru, and I know Colombia is spelled wrong, sorry about that, if there's anybody visiting from Colombia today. But you look at those two countries that are right next to Ecuador, and already you can see the numbers are dropping off, even though these two countries are 5 times the size of Ecuador. And as you get further and further away, you get numbers keep dropping off until you get all the way down here to the southern tip of Chile and Argentina. So you're down in Tierra del Fuego. There's only one hummingbird species there. And if we go in the opposite direction, we go all through Central America and all through the United States and Canada. We get back up here into Alaska. And once again, you have only one hummingbird species. In North America, or at least in the United States, we have 16 species roughly that will show up. And the vast majority of them are just barely coming across the Mexican border. So they're kind of in this region here and then up the California coast. We get to the eastern half of the United States, and the ruby-throated hummingbird is the only hummingbird that we really have here. There are some other things that are starting to happen. And so we're getting some interesting things going on. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But for the most part, we just have that one species here. So I'm really in the wrong place if I want to enjoy hummingbirds. But what that means is that I travel a lot. So I've been to Ecuador probably 10 times now. I've been to Colombia, Peru a couple times, Bolivia, all the way down to Argentina, Brazil a couple times, Venezuela, Guyana, Panama, Costa Rica a few times, Belize a couple times. So I've covered a lot of their range, and I've seen quite a few hummingbird species in the process. I think I'm up to about 210 or something like that now. So I have a ways to go. I know that I'll never see all of them, but it sure is fun trying. So let's take that focus, a closer look at the hummingbird that we have here. This is the ruby-throated hummingbird, and it's named for that very ruby throat here. You can see it in these two images quite clearly. These are both males. This is a immature male here. So this is something that you might actually see at your feeders right now. If you look and you see a whitish throat, look closely, and if you see little dapplings of spots in the throat, which are barely visible in this image, but they are there, that's an immature male. And then our females would have a completely clean white throat. So this is our one hummingbird species. You can see that the range is quite large. It does cover all of the eastern half of the United States, and then actually through the plains of Canada. It's going to stretching across all these plain states or provinces. In the wintertime, we're going to have them migrating down to the very southern coast of the United States, and they do make their way down through Mexico, and we do have them here in the Yucatan, and the farthest south that I've ever seen them coincides with this map, and that's down in Panama. So they do make it that far, but they do not make it down actually into South America. So here's an interesting little map. This is something comes from a Cornell website, and they are keeping track of hummingbird migration every spring. So this particular map image is from the spring of 2010, and you can go to this website here and you can actually get more current information. I think the most recent one loaded out there last time I checked was 2018. But basically across all of this range, we have people that are watching their hummingbird feeders every spring. And so they can then log in and record the fact when they see their very first hummingbird for the spring. So in 2010, we had hummingbirds hitting our Chicagoland area, and DuPage County is right about out here for those of you that are far, far away from us. Right where my cursor is right now, that's about where we're located. And so about this time, or about April 4th, is when we first seen our hummingbirds in 2010. And you can actually track their progress by watching, as people post on this website. And it's interesting, if you really study these numbers, you can see that there's actually two populations that are kind of making their way up north. You have these ones that are coming from the Florida southern tip here, and then you have these others that are actually moving around the Gulf and coming up through Texas. They can make that migration across the Gulf. That's a little over 500 miles for them, which they are actually capable of doing. They can actually store enough energy to make that flight all the way across. I know there are some myths out there about hummingbirds, in order to make great flights like that, hopping a ride on the back of a Canada goose. And that's something that I've heard, many times people have brought up to me when I'm doing these programs. So I'm going to just kind of shoot that myth right here. If you do pull out your North American field guide, take a look at where Canada geese winter, and you'll find that some of them will winter along the Texas coast here, and they'll get down into Mexico a little bit. But they're not, for the most part, they're not leaving North America. So somehow those hummingbirds, if they are flying across here, they're doing it on their own. No help at all from the Canada goose. So a little factoid that's kind of interesting is that as these hummingbirds are migrating across North America, as they're making their way up north, their leading edge, the progress that they're making, it actually coincides with another species, and that's the yellow-bellied sapsucker. So hummingbirds are not likely to migrate any further than the sapsuckers have migrated at that point in the migration. And the reason for that is, when you think about, so they're hitting Chicago area around April 4th, or at least they were in 2010. So how many insects or flying insects are around at that time? How many flowers are blooming at that time? There's really not a lot going on for them. So they have to find some alternative food sources. And one of the things that they like to do is they'll actually go to the sap wells that have been dug out by yellow-bellied sapsuckers, and they'll utilize those for two things. They can actually get any insects that were attracted to the sap, or they can drink the sap itself. So that's their main food source, or can be one of their major food sources at that time. So it's unlikely that you'll see ruby-throated hummingbirds migrating much further north than sapsuckers have already migrated that spring. So that's kind of a cool thing. So now let's start narrowing down even further, and let's start looking at our backyard. And so there's some things that we can do that are very easy in order to attract hummingbirds. And I know as people were logging in, somebody mentioned that they didn't have any hummingbirds in their yard, even though they had their feeders up, and then they eventually took their feeders down and gave up. Well, I'm going to start out by saying that the easiest thing you can do is just put up a hummingbird feeder. So we'll have to delve deeper into your problem down there in Southern Illinois. When I started looking to attract hummingbirds to my yard, that's all I did is I just hung out some feeders. And if they're in your area, if you somehow coincide with a territory of a male, you're going to end up getting hummingbirds showing up in your yard. If you don't have that luxury, you may at least catch them as they're migrating north. And once they do find your food source, they're going to keep coming back to it year after year as they migrate. They do remember where their food sources are on their migration route. And so they're able to, relocate those every year. And they don't live a real long time, but they will, while they are alive, if they have a hot spot there that's in your backyard, they'll most likely remember it and visit it. So putting up a feeder is the first thing you can do. Having some plants that will aid in attracting the hummingbirds to your yard is number two. And those can be annuals that you plant that are non-native, like these red salvia that I have in the image here. That's a nice showy plant. It's bright red. It's bound to attract hummingbirds, right? So, many people do use a plant like that. And there are many other annuals that you can use. But what I prefer that you all try to use is native plants. The more native we go, the better off we're all going to be you want to have a lot of diversity in your yard, and you can complement your native plants with some annual non-natives, but for the most part, it's great if you can get those natives in there. Planting a bunch of flowers and having enough diversity in those flowers so that there are some species of flowers that are actually blooming all through your growing season, and that can only be achieved by a lot of diversity. The better chances you're going to have of having hummingbirds in your yard. The third thing that you might think would attract hummingbirds would be to have some kind of water source. And I never see hummingbirds drinking out of a bird bath, and pretty much they can get all the fluids they need from that nectar that they're drinking, so that's not really necessary. But they do like to bathe. I've never seen one bathe in my bird baths, but even just the other day I was out sprinkling some of my flowers with the garden hose, and I saw a hummingbird land on a little twig, very near where I was sprinkling. So I lightened up the spray on the nozzle, and I just started shifting the position of my nozzle a little bit, and every now and then I'd kind of inch up towards the hummingbird until I started getting him wet. And then once he was enjoying that, then I just kind of left the sprinkler on him for a while, and he just opened up all of his feathers and was just writhing about and absorbing all the water he could and just loving every drop. So I have seen them do that. I've actually had them approach when I haven't noticed them, I've had them just fly right up into the mist of my garden hose while I was out watering. I've had that happen many times. And I've also seen them, after you're done watering and you have little water droplets that kind of pool up on the surfaces of leaves, they'll actually land on those leaves and they kind of roll their body into those little water droplets. So they'll get water and bathe that way as well. The only time I've ever seen a hummingbird take a full bath was, I was in Belize one time, and we were walking down a trail, and there was a little pool adjacent to the trail, and a hummingbird called the purple crowned fairy was coming in, and he would hover around the pond, kind of checking it out, I guess making sure it was safe, and then all of a sudden he would just plunge right down into the water head first. And he did that repeatedly. He'd come out of the water, plunge back in, out of the water, plunge back in. So he did that several times when he went up on a perch and preened for a while. And then he went back to hovering around the pond, checking it out, making sure it was clear, and then he started the whole process all over again. So that was the most rigorous bathing I've ever seen by a hummingbird. It was pretty amazing, and I'll never forget that one. So anyway, these are the basic things that you can do in order to attract the hummingbirds to your yard. And we're going to delve into that a little deeper as well. I've already alluded to some of the things that are going on with hummingbirds. They're going to use more than nectar as a food source, and that nectar can either come from flowers or it can come from your feeder. But as one of their major food sources would be nectar. The next one would be insects. And the middle image here shows a immature male ruby-throated hummingbird, and you can see it's plucking an insect out of a spider web. So I've not actually witnessed them pulling insects out of spider webs, but I have seen them fly catching. I've seen them catching insects in midair. I've also seen them foraging along the sides of my house or along the walls of evergreens in my backyard. And they'll just hover up and down, and they're just surveying that whole surface looking for insects that might be crawling around. And they'll do this at certain times. They really need to increase the protein in their diet when they are raising young. And so I actually notice a difference in the visits to my hummingbird feeders at that time. They'll visit maybe early on in the day and then very late in the day. But during the middle of the day, when the insects are most active, they're out searching for insects. And I've actually watched them do that. Rather than go to the feeder, they're going to my evergreens and looking for insects. So the third thing that they can do, I mentioned earlier, and here's an example of a hummingbird coming to yellow-bellied sapsucker sap wells. And most of the softwoods are going to be things that the sapsuckers really like to drill these holes in. And I'm sure in walking through the woods at some point in time, you've probably noticed neat rows of holes going around the sides of the tree. And those are being drilled by yellow-bellied sapsuckers. So this hummingbird here is actually at one of these sap wells. It's probably getting some of the sap that's stored up or coming out of the well. So there are those different sources. And I'm going to tell you a couple of little interesting stories just to make a point that hummingbirds are very, very protective of their food sources, because when you think about it, with the high metabolism that they have, they're very, very close to starvation all day long. So they need to be feeding all of the time. They're very curious. So they're always looking for new food sources. They're very aggressive because they want to protect those food sources once they find them. So this example here that I'm going to tell you kind of gives you a real focus on just how protective and how aggressive they can be. So I was in Ecuador in 2015. We were traveling with another couple, and two of us were sitting out on the deck. It was raining out. We couldn't go out birding. So we had a big bank of hummingbird feeders in front of us. You can see the main post in this image here. You can see this is where all the hummingbird feeders were hanging. They had like a big T-post here. So there were all sorts of feeders that were hanging there. And one of the other people in the group came out with this red book. And I noticed that the hummingbirds were immediately attracted to it. So I asked if I could borrow it, and I put it in my lap. And no sooner had I done that than I had this species here. This is a brown violet ear. I had them landing on my knee. So then I got the bright idea that if I put my fingers out as little perches on the corners, I would get hummingbirds landing on my fingers. And sure enough, here's one landing on my finger. And he was actually poking his head down into this little dark area here, thinking there must be some food port down there. And he just kept poking his little head down there. Well, all the feeders that were hanging here were slowly but surely all being emptied out by the hummingbirds. So this gentleman here who worked at the lodge, he was busily taking down the feeders and cleaning them, but he wasn't replacing them. So at one point, there were hardly any feeders left, and all of a sudden the hummingbirds were going crazy, but they did remember this little red book. So next thing I knew, I had hummingbirds all around me. And this here is a golden-tailed sapphire. I had one of those hovering right next to my face, so close that I could actually feel its wings touching my cheek. And that was pretty amazing in itself. But the next thing that happened was even more bizarre. I could feel its bill go into my ear, and then I felt its tongue lick me inside my ear. He must not have liked earwax because he only did it one time. But then right after that, within seconds, I had a brown violet ear came up off of the book, and he was right up in my face, and he did the same thing to my nose. So I wish that this wasn't a webinar right now so I could hear you all laughing. I'd feel a lot better about that. Or maybe you're all like thinking this guy's as strange as can be. I've been visiting Ecuador for over a 20-year period, all of South America over that 20-year period. I've never ever encountered anything like this. This was the most bizarre situation I've ever experienced, but it was really cool. So 3 years later, I'm back at the same place. And by the way, this is in Ecuador on the east slope of the Andes. We're at about 6,000 feet. It was a place called the Wild Sumaco Lodge. So here I am back at the same lodge. This time I came prepared. I had that little jar. I painted the lip of the jar the same color as the hummingbird feeder. And then I brought some little sugar packets with me. So I mixed up my sugar water, and I decided to see if I could get the hummingbirds to land on my finger again. Well, you can tell by the response of these fawn-breasted brilliants, they don't want to have anything to do with me. So it was really strange to me that, you know, when I was just sitting there minding my own business, they were all over me, and now they don't want to have anything to do with me. So I found that interesting.
I think I speak for the other attendees of the webinar saying, at least most of us are jealous of the experience of getting to see them up quite so close, except for Dina, who apparently doesn't. They freak her out a little too much, so.
Okay. It was actually pretty cool. So I did get another encounter with some hummingbirds. This one is in Jamaica, and I was just there last December. And on our way out, we had to go back to Montego Bay, and right near there's a bird sanctuary. It's called the Rockland Bird Sanctuary. If you're ever in Jamaica, I highly recommend you go there. All sorts of feeding stations there, many different species that you can see. It's a pretty cool experience. Well, one of the things that's going on there is that the hummingbirds have been habituated to come to people, and they give you these little jars, kind of like the little whiskey bottles you get on the airline, and they drill a hole in there, and so the jar is full of sugar water instead of tequila, I guess. And you can see this is a red-billed streamer tail. This is one of the main reasons I went to Jamaica, was to see this very hummingbird species. It does have a little red bill, and the streamer tails are coming all the way down to about here. So extremely long-tailed hummingbird. And this species, along with another thing called the Jamaican mango, would readily come to your fingers and feed. And so everybody that was on tour with me, they all had the opportunity to feed the hummingbirds this way. So it was really a cool experience. That's what I looked like pre-COVID-19, by the way. So I was clean shaven back then. So now we're back in my backyard, now that we know just how aggressive and how curious hummingbirds can be. And so when I was putting this program together, I just kind of walked through my backyard and just took pictures of whatever flowers were blooming at that time. And so starting up here in the top left, this is something called yellow honeysuckle vine, which is a native. It's a native honeysuckle. And it has a very interesting flower. It's not a dramatic flower by any means, but the hummingbirds, when this is blooming, the hummingbirds are all over this. This is the main thing that they'll come to my yard for when I have that plant blooming. Here's rhododendrons. They'll utilize those. I think everybody can kind of envision hummingbirds at wild columbine. And so, yeah, they do utilize it. But this might surprise you. This is Solomon seal, and you can see the little bell-shaped flowers that hang underneath the stem. And they'll actually utilize that quite extensively. That's another one of the big favorites in my yard. And they'll run right up the line. I actually have some video showing this. But they'll run right up the line and they hit every one of the little flowers. I do have this plant in the front of my yard. This is another honeysuckle. This one's called dwarf honeysuckle. It's also a native. And it gets these little tiny yellow flowers. I mean, these are no bigger than the size of an eraser on a pencil. They're very small. But the hummingbirds love them, and I do see them feeding off of that. And spiderwort, this is a prairie plant that people are probably familiar with, and that would be utilized as well. So we're going to try shooting a video or showing a video here. Let's hopefully this runs. Here we go. So here's a ruby-throated, and he's just going to go right on down the line, and he's going to hit all these flowers. That's not the kind of flower you would expect that a hummingbird would be attracted to, but they do utilize them. So a lesson learned there. You can use any kind of flowers. So here's some more examples. Here we have butterfly weed, which is a prairie flower, prairie blazing star, obviously a prairie flower. New Jersey tea, again, prairie, wild petunia, hoary vervain, foxglove beard's tongue. So these are all things that you could easily work into your landscape. They're all flowering plants that do like a lot of sunlight. So many of you probably have a situation in your yards where you can utilize these plants. Here's some more prairie plants. We've got purple coneflower. This is kind of a wetland sedge, palm sedge. It's actually Carex muskingamensis. And although it doesn't have any kind of a showy flower at all, I was looking at a website that the state publishes, and they actually have this listed along with northern dropseed as two plants that hummingbirds will utilize. So I include that here, and I do have plenty of this in my front yard. The wild bergamot or monarda is another one that you probably can easily use in your landscaping, and some showy things like cardinal flower, which will like it a little bit wetter, or great blue lobelia. And then we have smooth blue aster as well, smooth blue aster. So all these things can easily work into your landscape. And it can be a little bit of a challenge finding native plants for your landscaping. So there are some places that you can go. You probably have local nurseries in your own neighborhoods that you can check out. But there are other things, there are other places you can go as well. And some of those would be the DuPage County Forest Preserve District does have a spring native plant sale every year, and they do hold that. This year it was all ordering online. There was no store shopping for that one, but normally they do have where you can just go out there that day that they have the pickup, and you can shop to your heart's content and buy even more than what you pre-ordered. So that's a great source. The Conservation Foundation has a native plant sale in the springtime as well. And for those of you that are local, Wheaton Park District also has a very good native plant sale. So all those are sources that you can easily check out. And again, you can go to all your local nurseries. Each one of them will probably have a little corner set aside where they'll have some native plants. And you don't have to use exclusively native plants. It's great to have the native plants. Those I think benefit our pollinators more than anything. But you can also supplement that with some non-native perennials or some non-native annuals. Just the other day I saw a hummingbird that was feeding off of our marigolds. And so they're obviously utilizing the non-natives too. They do like the hostas of all kinds. I've seen them feeding at that as well. So once some of my woodland spring ephemeral type flowers are all done blooming, I will see some of these other flowers taking their place and the hummingbirds utilizing those. So the main thing that I want to stress is that you have a lot of diversity in your yard, and that you have flowers that are going to be blooming throughout the whole breeding season, so that there's always some food source in your yard. So here's a list that I compiled just from the images that I've just utilized in the program in the last 10 minutes or so that we've been talking. And so this list has all the common names, and then there's also a scientific name to go along with that if you want to hit your print screen key on your computer right now and then save that off to a Word document for later printing, then you would have this list. So when you do go to a local nursery, you'll not only have a common name, but you'll actually have a scientific name as well, so you don't end up, you know, with the wrong plants. So if you've accomplished that print screen key thing, then we can move on. And of course, you know, as Jamie said before, they're going to post this video, so you can always come back and look at this again. So to supplement all those native plants that you've now planted in your backyard, we can also have that hummingbird feeder. And there's quite a variety of hummingbird feeders to choose from. There's just all shapes and sizes, all different kinds of formats. And this one here seems to be pretty popular. I see a lot of people utilizing that one. I think the simpler the hummingbird feeder is, the easier it is to clean. That's what you should be thinking about when you're picking out your hummingbird feeder. And I'll have an example in just a minute of what I utilize in my backyard, so that you can get an idea of, you know, a very simplistic one that's easy to fill and easy to clean. The cleaning is the most important thing of all. So when you are going to mix your own nectar, we're going to mix it on a 1-to-4 ratio. So 1 cup versus 4 cups. And you can measure out however much nectar you want to create based on the population of hummingbirds you have in your yard. Now, I have maybe a half dozen hummingbirds coming to my feeders at the moment, so I don't need a whole bunch of nectar all created all at one time. So what I do is, rather than mixing in cups, I'm mixing in tablespoons. So for a couple tablespoons, I'm putting 8 tablespoons of water. And that's enough for one of my feeders, and that'll last for, you know, at least 3 days generally. And one of the key things is to not mix up so much water and filling your feeder and then having just a couple of hummingbirds there, and that nectar in the feeder is going to go bad, especially in the summertime when it's really hot. So there's no point in putting a lot of nectar juice out there. You're just wasting product at that point. So when you are mixing, you want to use cane sugar. You could use beet sugar, that would be okay, but do not use any other weird sugars, synthetic sugars. You don't want to use honey. And tap water is fine, and it does not have to be boiled. If you do boil it, then make sure it's cooled before you actually put it into the feeder. And there's absolutely no need to add any food coloring to that. Your feeder will supply, you know, the red coloring, and even if it isn't red, they manage to find food sources. As I said, they're very curious, so they'll find any food source that's out there. So you do want to replace that mixture in your feeder at least once a week. And again, when it's hot, you want to do it more frequently. So by mixing in small amounts, I actually force myself to fill my feeders more frequently, which means I clean them more frequently. And that's very, very important. We'll get to that. If you do want to mix a large concentration of this of the nectar, you can do that, and you can store it in your refrigerator and just put a little out at a time, and that way the nectar will last longer in your refrigerator, up to a couple of weeks. So I think we've covered all that I wanted to here. So here we are in the cleaning phase. So here's the hummingbird feeder that I like to use. And in the last webinar, somebody wanted to know the name of that, and I didn't have it, but I did pull the tag out here. So the brand is First Nature, and it's a small feeder. You know, this reservoir is not very big, but again, I never filled the reservoir. If the nectar line comes up to about here in my reservoir, when I fill it, that's about as much as it is. Most of it will be in the saucer area here, and that's enough to last me for 3 or 4 days. So this screws out very easily. It's a very wide rim here. So the mouth of the reservoir is very, very wide, which is key to cleaning, and that's one of the main reasons I like it. The saucer part here snaps apart with just an easy twist. It opens up, and you have these 2 pieces. So now you can get inside, and you can get all of this scrubbed out. And after you do that, you want to rinse it very, very heavily. What I do is I rinse all the suds off, and then I make sure I get everything soaked again 3 times. So I'm triple rinsing everything. And then you let it air dry out on a towel here before you put any nectar back in. So all of these steps are very important. Making sure that you get all the dark material that's in here. Once you open this up, if you have left your hummingbird feeder up too long, you'll see bacteria growing inside here. And that's crucial to get all of that out. That's probably one of the main things that you can do to harm your hummingbirds is to not clean your feeders. So it's a lot of work. You have to develop a routine and you have to get used to doing that. But if that sounds like too much work to you, then you probably shouldn't be trying to feed hummingbirds. So we're going to talk a little bit about hummingbird mortality. And one of the biggest problems can be those hummingbird feeders, because that bacteria in the feeders can kill them. Another thing that can become a big issue is spider webs. And I had an image there earlier that showed you a hummingbird actually going to the web for some food. And they will do that. And they'll also go to the web to collect nesting material. They do use spider webs when they're building their nests. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So in any of those trips to a spider web, they can easily get hung up in there. And once they do, they're not likely to get out. And large enough spiders will actually prey upon them. Another big problem is people accidentally leaving the door open to their garage or to a front porch or something. So the hummingbirds, again, being very curious, they may see something red inside or whatever that attracts them. And so they go inside and then they get confused and they can't find their way out. So again, because of their high metabolism and their need to feed so frequently, they're going to exhaust themselves very, very quickly. So if you do encounter a hummingbird trapped inside of a garage or a porch or something like that, rather than try and catch the hummingbird, which is, then you run the risk of damaging the hummingbird's wings or feathers or something. So you want to be very careful about this. And one of the things you can do is you can actually get a hummingbird feeder and put it up so that it's somewhere where the hummingbird will easily see it. And at this point, they're going to be starving, so they're going to go right to that feeder most likely. And when they do that, after that feeding, then you can move the feeder a little bit towards the door or wherever you're trying to lure the hummingbird to. So just keep on subsequent visits, you can just keep moving that feeder until you get it close enough to the doorway and they realize their way out and they will escape. So that's probably the easiest way to do it without actually coming in contact with the hummingbird. Another problem would be some plant species like burdock have these flower heads that have little burrs at the end of them, and those hooks on those burrs can actually trap a hummingbird. And I have never seen this happen to a hummingbird, but obviously here's a picture of one where it happened. And I have seen things, small birds like kinglets get hung up on there. I had a Tennessee warbler one time hung up on there. I actually found a bat one time hung up on burdock. And once they're hung up on there, they have no way to push themselves off, so they're going to die there. And in all these cases, the only survivor was that Tennessee warbler. So surprisingly, plants can be an issue. And I imagine they're probably going to that plant not for the nectar, but probably looking for insects. So some other mortality issues are praying mantises. Will try to ambush hummingbirds at their feeders or at some flowers. And I've seen pictures of snakes, trying to do the same thing, and they do actually capture the hummingbirds. Window strikes are a danger for all birds, and hummingbirds are no different. So, so that can be an issue. And pesticides are harmful in two ways. If you're using insecticides, you can eliminate one of the food sources for the hummingbirds, and if they actually end up eating contaminated insects, then the toxins from the chemicals are all going to be concentrating as that is moving its way through the food chain, and the hummingbird is the top of that food chain. So they're going to perish over time. So let's talk about something a little more pleasant, hummingbird courtship and nesting. And so I think before we really got started, we were talking a bit about this. I'm going to repeat it for everyone that hadn't signed in yet. So the male ruby-throated hummingbird, he has a very large territory that he owns. He works very, very hard to protect that territory, and he's driving all other males away. So over a large area, you may have only that one male hummingbird. And protecting that food source is what makes him special as the females arrive. So they like the fact that he has this territory that has all of these food sources available. So it's a very, very good territory. In order for him to hold that territory, he must be one of the top guns. So he's a very desirable male to mate with. So in addition to having offspring that are going to come from this very good male, the females also have a territory that's being protected for them, and they'll utilize that territory as they're raising their young. So we don't see very many ruby-throated hummingbird males at our feeders. We're going to see mostly females. More than one female will come to that territory, and the male will mate with any females that do come to that territory. So part of their courtship will involve a courtship flight that they do, which is a very elliptical flight. that goes way high up into the air and then kind of loops back down, and it just looks like they're making this big elliptical loop in the air, and it can go pretty high. So the female is probably perched somewhere and she's just enjoying all of this. But after they do mate, the female is going to take over all the rest of the responsibilities. She will stay within that territory, and she'll assume the nest building and the raising of the young. So here we have an example of a cup-shaped nest. This is what their nests look like. You can see it's very, very small. These eggs in here are probably about the size of a pea. I mean, they're very, very small. So obviously in comparison, then the rest of this nest is very large. There's barely enough room for her to sit in there. This is where it's those spider web lines come in handy. So they use that to wrap everything together. And so those are flexible. And so the nest can actually expand as the young grow in the nest. They also use that webbing to help camouflage the nest. So they've used lichens. You can see all the little speckly things all around the edges here. And they're utilizing that to help camouflage the nest. The inside is probably with utilizing very fluffy material like you would get from a cattail. I've seen them collecting that for nesting. So that would be what the inside is like. And she can come and tend to the young there and easily feed them and not worry about them growing out of the nest because of that spider webbing. Pretty ingenious. So the whole time this is going on, that male is still maintaining that territory, and he's hoping another female comes along. And if she does, she will mate with him, and she will probably also set up household within that same territory. So here's another little video. If you look at this this picture, it's not easy to pick out the hummingbird nest that's in there, but I'm going to start the video and she will take you right to that nest. And there you go. She's on the nest. She's working on the inside lining there. And I'm not sure what she was doing at the start of this video. She was kind of looking at those branches. We'll watch it just one more time, but she was kind of eyeing up those branches right in here. So I don't know if she's actually looking for insects while she's doing that, or if she's just possibly looking for more lichens to pop on here. But let's look at that just one more time. But you can see she's clearly, eyeballing these branches right here. And there she goes. Pretty hard to find their nests. You have to really be watching to figure out. And by the way, both of these videos, they come to me courtesy of Mark Donnelly. He's one of the naturalists working at Fermilab along with me. I do birds, he does dragonflies, and he shoots some great videos of dragonflies, and then he did these hummingbirds as well. So I'm fortunate to have those in the program because of Mark Donnelly. So that brings us to the end. So I want to thank you all for participating in this webinar, and hopefully we've given you some bird food for thought, and I hope you'll join us again in the future as we explore all things bird related.
Thank you, Dennis. That was very, very interesting. And obviously everyone else enjoyed it too, because we have a lot of questions.
Okay, I'm going to stop my share at this point. There we go. So there we are again. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to kind of summarize some of the questions. And
yeah. I'll go through them and kind of condense as much as I can. So okay. First, let's go back to basics. There were a couple of questions about how do you tell the males from the females?
Okay, so
on the ruby throats.
Yes, on the ruby-throated hummingbird, if you see a hummingbird that has a dark throat, then that's going to be the male. It won't necessarily look very, very red. Because here's the funny thing about hummingbirds. I showed you all those pictures and they all look very colorful and everything, but basically hummingbirds create color through pigment only for two colors, black and rufous, which is kind of a rusty color. All the other coloration that you see on hummingbirds is generated by little microscopic air pockets that are in the barbules of the feathers. And so how those are refracting light is what's giving you the colorations that you see. So a ruby-throated hummingbird's throat, the male, if he doesn't have sunlight on it, it's going to look black. So what you want to notice just is the fact that the hummingbird's throat is dark. Okay, so it may not look ruby red, it might just look dark. The females will have an all white throat. And now, because of the timing of, where we are in their breeding season, birds are fledging already, and you'll see some juvenile males, and those will have little stippling in their throat. So you'll see just like little tiny spots, which are hardly noticeable. But if you have a pair of binoculars handy and you're watching your feeder with binoculars, you'll notice when a immature or juvenile male shows up.
Perfect.
So hopefully that covers that.
Yeah. Well, and that answers another question. Somebody else had said that their mother, I think, had reported an all dark hummingbird at their feeder and wondered what that might be, but it was very likely just a ruby throat with weird sun, weird light refracting off of it.
Yeah, and so that reminds me of something I left out that I didn't talk about that I was planning to. I said that aside from our ruby-throated hummingbird being our main breeding species, and that's the expected species here, we do now see some other hummingbirds showing up. And one of them is the rufous hummingbird. And it's going to look very, very rusty brown when you see that hummingbird. And where they typically breed is way up in Alaska. That's the one species that makes it up to Alaska. So along the western coast of Canada and up in Alaska, that's where rufous hummingbirds will breed. And then where they winter, they're going down to the far southwest or all the way down into Mexico. That's where they're going to winter. So that should be their normal migration path. But some rufous hummingbirds had a little wackiness going on with their gyroscope, I guess. So they ended up started going to Florida and to Georgia and other Southeast United States states. So now these birds were making that migration, and they were successful in doing that because the food sources were there, with all the changes over time with people, landscaping and everything, there were plenty of food sources there for them, and people always had feeders out in that area as well. So they were successfully doing this, and they know that they were successful because there's people that are banding hummingbirds in that region. And so they were actually recapturing birds they had captured previously. So they knew they were making the trip again and again. So as they're migrating from up there in the Northwest and they're going down to the Southeast, some of them now come through Illinois. And there are records of rufous hummingbirds in Illinois. And one thing that, just to take it one step further, I showed you that map that showed the progression of the ruby-throated hummingbird as it was migrating in the spring. Well, there's a map similar to that for rufous hummingbird too, and they're now showing that some rufous hummingbirds are going up to Maine.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So stay tuned because at some point in time, they're going to be successful breeding up there. And now we're going to have a viable population. I just saw a hummingbird in my window. We're going to have a viable population of rufous hummingbirds in the Northeast. And so it's just a matter of time before that starts to spread. And so, stay tuned. In a couple of 100 years, we'll probably have rufous hummingbirds nesting here in Illinois.
Okay, very cool.
So I think that's very interesting. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier.
No, yeah, that's perfect. I know I had heard about the rufous ones being here, but at the time it was a very unusual thing. It was a very rare sighting, and needed photo confirmation and things like that. So
I've yet to see one. And
yeah,
when I was still working in the Charles Park District, I didn't leave my feeders here at home. I took them to work with me and hung them outside because that's where I was all day. So I would hang them up there so that I could watch for rufous hummingbirds coming through. And I didn't miss by much. About 2 miles away from where I was stationed in St. Charles, somebody came with a rufous hummingbird in their yard. So I didn't miss by much.
Hey, speaking of the feeders, we've had a couple of questions about bees and ants around the feeders. So is it harmful if there are ants in the feeder? Do they eat the ants? Are the bees dangerous?
They seem to not be crazy about the ants. And so I meant to actually, there's something called an ant moat. And I'm going to draw one since I forgot to bring it in. So give me a second. It's basically a cup. And at the bottom of a cup, there will be a little thing you can hang your feeder on. But then let's say you have your feeder on a shepherd's hook. This is kind of what you're looking for, something like that.
Okay, yeah, I've seen them. It's almost like if you think of a cap.
She's running outside to get one for me, I'll bet. I just heard her run out the door. So you can see there's that cup. And so there's a little chain that comes down from the shepherd's hook and it goes into the bottom of the cup and you fill that with water. And then on the outside bottom of the cup, there's a little place where you can hook on your, right right there. That's where you would then hook on your hummingbird feeder. So that'll take care of your ant problem. I've tried putting Vaseline on the shepherd's hook or whatever you're hanging your feeder on, and the rains will wash that off. And I've never found it to be completely effective
And
anyway.
I've heard that can be really bad for them if like if it gets in their wings and stuff, that's generally not advised.
Everyone say hi to Melissa. So here's the.
Okay, perfect.
So
Judy says they work, and she bought hers at Ace Hardware. So
okay, I bought this at Menards. I wasn't going to be a name dropper, but yeah, I did get that one at Menards. So probably any box store or anywhere where you can find your hummingbird feeders, you'll probably find that. That piece of equipment as well. So they're very effective. I haven't had any ant problems since then.
Okay, and good to know.
The feeder that I'm using now, I don't really have much in the way of bee problems or yellow jackets. When I use the ones that have those, they kind of look like little flowers. It was early in my program, the Perky Pet one.
Yeah.
That style seems to have more of a bee problem. And they do have those little yellow bee guards to keep the bees out. But that's just more places for bacteria to grow. They're extremely hard to clean. They break eventually. So this kind that I'm using now has a very small port, and I don't know if the yellow jackets can't get down in there, but I really am not experiencing a lot of trouble with yellow jackets or bees right now. So hopefully that answers that question. If you have a follow-up question, if that wasn't clear enough, let me know.
Yeah, I know. I've been having some at mine as well, and I have an Oriole feeder up nearby too, and so it seems this time of year, I don't know if nectar is just getting scarce as we get later into the summer or what, but I know as the year goes on, I seem to be seeing more and more wasps and ants at my feeders. So
I think it has more to do with the life cycle for the yellow jackets, and they're at the point where they start storing a lot of energy. So I think that that's why they're feeding so vigorously, and they seem to want anything with any sweetness at all. So fruit falling off of trees, or I mean, you have to just be careful all around your yard. So.
Okay.
What else have we got?
Let's see. Oh, I just had a good one. Where did we go?
They're all good.
They are all good. They really are. There's a ton of good questions, and it's hard for me to pick them out. Okay.
I hope we answer them all, because I'm willing to sit here as long as it takes. I don't know what your schedule.
So we have a couple of questions about nests and babies. So is there a preferred type of tree for them to build their nests in, conifers or deciduous or?
I've seen them in any kind of situation. They don't even have to be in trees. At the Arboretum, I've seen them in large trees. I don't know that I've ever seen them on a conifer, but it wouldn't surprise me in the least. Quite often, well, the example that we showed, that video, that I believe that was a silver maple, is where that. So I know I used to work at Plum Creek Nature Center down in Beecher, and we were able to find a nest near there. It was way up high in an oak tree. And the only reason we found it was because we had hummingbird feeders set up in front of our window, and somebody would go out on a smoke break, and he was watching one go from the feeder back up into the tree multiple times. And after he saw that a few times, he went and got binoculars, and we were able to find the nest up there. They are so tiny. I mean, you can't even understand how tiny they are until you see one up close. I mean, we're talking, the cup is that big around. It's hardly larger than the diameter of a quarter.
Yes. And so, and they're so well camouflaged with the lichens and the spider webs. They are almost impossible to find. So, really watch them and see where they go back and forth. I had a couple of evergreen trees that were near my feeder, and I would watch them go from my feeder into those evergreens. Now, I don't know if there was a nest in there. I always kind of suspected there was, or if they were just going in there to get bugs off the sap on the tree. I don't know. They always seem to really, really like those evergreens, though.
I do see them, when they're looking for insects, I do see them concentrating a lot on conifers. So they do like my arborvitae, and then we have some neighbors with spruce trees, and they seem to go all over the spruce trees too. So it could be they're doing that, or there could have been a nest in there somewhere as well.
Let's see, got that one. And then what do the parents feed the babies? Is it like a crop milk, or do they actually feed them insects? Or
I think I've never been that close. I'm very intimate with hummingbirds, but they've never invited me in for that. I believe that they're probably, because they're coughing that food back up so quickly. So I can't imagine that they're breaking it down into some kind of a milk kind of a material. So I imagine they're just delivering the nectar and the insects in whole. That would be my guess. I don't know that for a fact. Good question.
How long do they
I
live?
have to do some research on that one.
Yeah. How long does the average hummingbird live?
You know, it being such a tiny animal like that, 3 to 5 years is probably the reasonable range. However, they have examples of them living much longer than that. There was a rufous hummingbird female that had been banded multiple times, and they knew her to be, I want to say, if it wasn't 13 years old, it might have been even 17 years. It was a very long time. I can't remember the exact number, but it was in the teens. And so, but typically you're looking at like a 5-year kind of thing.
Okay.
And for most of them, they don't make it out of the first year. And that's true with most things in wildlife,
Sure.
Your fledglings from every year, only 15% or so make it to the next year. So hummingbirds would be no different than that.
And going back to the feeding question, Catherine says she thinks only doves feed crop milk. Hummers feed their nestlings insects like most land birds do. So thank you for that.
Okay.
Catherine.
Yeah.
I'm not up on my bird feeding their young stuff.
Yeah.
Let's see. When's the best time to see hummingbirds during the day?
Well, it's interesting. It seems like there's a bit of a flurry in the morning, which is not, I guess it shouldn't be a surprise, but they probably get up way before we do. I do notice at the end of the day when I'm sitting out on my patio that there will be a flurry of activity again, and we just get a lot of visits that are just coming in quite a bit. And then during the middle of the day, it all depends. I think I alluded to this earlier too, that depending on if they're feeding young or not, they're going to be looking for that protein more. So they'll not be using your hummingbird feeder as much. They decide what they need. And that usually is another question that comes up. People wonder if you're hurting the hummingbirds in some way by supplying the artificial nectar. And they're only going to utilize that to supplement their diet. They're probably only getting, at max, they're probably getting 25% of their diet out of your feeder, and the rest of the time they are out getting other real food. So they're just kind of supplementing. And a question that always comes up, so I'll just hit this one too right now, is it bad to leave my hummingbird feeder out? When should I take it down? And the way that I answer that is, hummingbirds, although they'll utilize your food source, they're not reliant on that food source. They're always reliant on more than one food source. So when it's time for them to migrate, they will migrate. They're not going to stick around just because they have a free meal. The way to look at it is that if you have a injured hummingbird, or a hummingbird that for some reason just is migrating late and he has some issues, your hummingbird feeder may end up being a salvation for that hummingbird. It's not going to cause him to stay, but it might be the lifeline that he needs. So don't be in any real hurry to take down your feeders in the fall. You're not going to prevent them from migrating.
Okay, that's good to know, because I've heard those questions as well too.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know if hummingbirds eat mosquitoes?
Boy, I sure hope so. They eat very, very small insects. I've been in situations where it's a bright sunny day and there's a real dark background, and you can see the little gnats or something, and very, very small insects that are flying in the air, and because they've got the sunlight on them with the real dark background, they're showing up. And I've seen hummingbirds come out and capture them in midair. Actually, in Ecuador one time, I was up on Yanacocha. It's a preserve. It's on the Pichincha Mountain, which is the one that erupts right outside of Quito. And we were way up on that mountain, and there was a sword-billed hummingbird up there. This is a hummingbird that has a bill that's as long as his body, if not a little bit longer. And he was fly catching. There was a swarm of insects that were too small enough that we couldn't see them, but he was actually hovering below the swarm, and he would fly up with his bill open like this. He'd close it and drop back down. And then he just kept doing that over again and over again. He just kept going up. He was catching an insect at a time with this bill that's, it's a bill that long. It's like a 4-inch long bill. Pretty incredible.
So a couple people missed the answers. We talked about it a little bit at the beginning, and but why we see more females than males typically at feeders.
So I was describing that whole courtship thing, and you know, a male's going to set up a territory, and those territories can be somewhat large, and they're not going to allow another male in that territory. So they own that. They own all the food sources that are within that territory, and that's what's going to attract those females. By him holding a very high quality, large territory, he's going to attract more females. So you've got that one male and then several females, plus their offspring, which none of them are going to look like, you know, full-blown males. So percentage-wise, you're already starting out with a small number of males in your population. And then depending on what he's feeding or what time he feeds, you may just miss them. I very seldom see males at my feeders, but sure. I do know that they're around. So that's kind of the answer for that one.
Okay.
There's a guy in Southern Illinois who was wondering why he wasn't getting any hummingbirds at his feeder. So I kind of wanted to address that a little bit too. I don't know when you set your feeders out, but you should probably at least get them, I would think, in migration. But during breeding season, you know, if there's much greater territories, you know, nearby you, and that male has captured those areas as his territory, then most likely, you know, that's where everybody's going. So they've just got better stuff than you have. So what you have to do then in that case is you have to hope to get some in migration that kind of stick around. But, you know, upgrading, you know, all the flowers around your gardens and everything like that, and just keep plugging along, and sooner or later you're gonna get somebody camping out at your spot. So.
And about how big is a male's territory?
That's a good question. I can't say for sure how large that territory is, but I mean, I picture it being easily a city block, you know, easily. It could be easily, you know, larger than that.
Okay.
So they're not, it's not like my backyard next to your backyard kind of a thing. They're going to be much greater than that. And maybe, was that Catherine that had another, let's put her to work again.
Yeah. There were several people asking that. Okay, so yeah, I wasn't entirely certain
whether they're feeding, you know, the whole insect or not. Whoever that was, have them check this one out now. I can use all the help I can get.
So there was another question too about will males chase females away from the feeder, or are they perhaps chasing an adolescent male?
They probably want to protect that food source. Yeah, so they would chase anybody.
Oh, again, okay.
They're just very aggressive animals. It's amazing how aggressive they are. For as small as they are, they're just extremely aggressive.
Oh yeah, I know. I've seen, you know, 3 females chasing each other around. Yeah. So females will definitely chase each other off. And it's kind of funny because you end up with this little standoff when they're on the opposite sides, and it's like, I don't think you can see me over there, so I'm just going to kind of hover down on this other side.
Right. And so, you know, when they're doing that, you know, it is interesting that they do get in these little stalemates, but you know, eventually somebody will push the other one out. You know, there is always this pecking order, no pun intended. So when you went in, I don't have a lot of hummingbirds here, so it's not a huge issue for me. But if you do have a lot of hummingbirds, then what you end up having to do is station another hummingbird feeder out of eyesight of the first hummingbird feeder, and that's kind of how you can get around.
Okay.
Somebody just ruling the roost all of the time.
Sure.
Just recently, I had it's a funny thing, you know, ever since I installed these little ant moats, well, chickadees now like to come to the ant moats to drink water. I never see them at my bird baths, but now that I have these little tiny cups hanging over my hummingbird feeder, that's where they go for water. So there was a chickadee trying to do that, and a hummingbird just took offense to the whole thing that it was there, and he started chasing the chickadee, and the chickadee, you know, darted off a little bit and thought it was safe, and the hummingbird was still on it, so he moved again, and he just went on like 3 times. The hummingbird just would not relent. It just stayed after that chickadee until he completely left the yard. It was pretty funny.
Oh, that's awesome.
Chickadee.
Let's see. At what age do fledglings start to fly and visit feeders?
I think it takes roughly 21 days for eggs to hatch. The chicks are probably in the nest equally amount of time, you know, about a 3-week period. And then after that, they're moving around. And once they leave the nest, you know, they're about adult size. They grow very rapidly. And that's why you're seeing those hummingbirds, you know, catching all that protein. They're just shoving all that food in there. The chicks are growing very quickly. And by the time they leave the nest, they are they are as big as adults. And that's pretty much true with most birds, that when a bird leaves the nest, that fledgling is pretty much adult size. It looks different, and some of the feathers aren't grown out, so
Okay.
it might be short-tailed or something, but basically body-wise, they're about adult size.
Is it too late to start putting out feeders now?
No, you're not at all. So we're going to be experiencing the fall migration pretty soon, and that will start up, here mid-August, late August, and it will go through into October. There'll still be hummingbirds migrating through. So now's a good time, because think about it. In the spring, you've got X number of hummingbirds, and now you've got all the fledglings that are joining that number. So, you should have theoretically a lot more hummingbirds right now migrating through.
All right. Are any predator birds or raptors interested in hummingbirds?
I don't have any stories about hummingbirds being attacked by raptors here, but in South America, I do know that things like bat falcons and some of the forest falcons are fast enough that they are capturing hummingbirds. So
I would think it would be just
put a merlin to it here, perhaps, maybe.
Yeah. I would think just from a maneuverability standpoint that they'd just be a little too nimble or for some of our hawks, but
Forest falcons are amazing, and they're stealth hunters. You can even watch that kind of behavior with our Cooper's hawks, which have now really adapted to an urban environment. That was a bird species that was really plummeting in numbers, and they're making a huge comeback because they learned how to live in our neighborhoods, and they know where our feeders are. And I've watched them hunt, and they cut angles in their flight. They cut angles so that they're using the building your house as a blind, and they cut that angle so that it's like rounding a base at third base. You got to cut that angle so that you're maximizing you're from point A to point B, right? And they do that, and so it's all totally by surprise. And the bat falcons and the forest falcons are incredible. How they can move so quickly through the forest just blows my mind.
Oh yeah, for sure. We've got a couple of migration questions here. So how far do they fly in a day? And can they fly over the Gulf of Mexico?
They can. There's been studies. No one's tagged a hummingbird and watched them fly across or anything. But through calculations, they've been able to prove that based on the amount of energy that they can store as fat, and I forget how many miles they can get out of a gram of fat, but the calculation is such that they can easily fly in the neighborhood of 700 miles and be pretty much assured of making that flight. And the shortest span across the Gulf of Mexico is something in the neighborhood of 500 miles. So they can easily get across the Gulf on their own. They don't need the help of a Canada goose. And how much they can fly in a day, I don't have at my fingertips. I don't have that number, but it would be something on a regular, when they're not trying to fly over a body of water like that, where they have to do it all in one leap. They would easily be flying 100 miles, if not a little bit more than that.
Okay. Sorry, I'm answering a few here.
Okay.
So let's see. Does it matter how high off the ground your feeder is?
No. That question came up. It was pretty funny that you asked that. That came up in the last webinar I did last week. Somebody wanted to know how high. And so I was thinking of my backyard, and I said, well, I've got one hanging that's only about 2 feet off the ground, and I got another one that's about 4 or 5 feet off the ground. And then I got to thinking, well, we were on a trip out in Colorado, and we were staying at a lodge, and we were on the second floor, and they had hummingbird feeders hanging from the eaves. And the hummingbirds were having no problem finding that. Well, somebody from the last webinar, they sent me an email just a couple of days ago, and they said that they live on they have a 4th-story apartment, and they had flowers up there, and they had a hummingbird up there. So they went and they purchased a hummingbird feeder. And so they've got hummingbirds on the 4th floor. So I don't think it matters how high you hang your hummingbird feeder. They will find it.
Do they prefer a feeder with a perch or no perch? Is there a benefit for the birds to rest their wings while feeding?
Yeah, the only benefit I could think of is that, they do have that high metabolism. And so, when they're flying, they're using energy as they're feeding. I suppose if they're sitting, while they're eating, then they're not utilizing as much energy. So I guess there's some benefit, but it's certainly not necessary at all. I've seen many feeders without a perch, and it's not a big issue. And also that sword-billed hummingbird I was telling you about a little while ago, I have seen those feeding at feeding stations, and with that bill, there's no way they're perching on a perch. They're
sure.
just totally hovering there. So it's not necessary, but I suppose there's some savings of energy by having.
And is there any benefit to hanging it in the sun versus in the shade?
I have one in the sun. I have one in the shade. I think during the summertime when it's really hot out, being in the sun, your sugar water can go bad more quickly.
Okay.
So the shade would be better in that regard. But as far as the hummingbird, they don't care. They will find them either way.
Okay. Let's see. Why is red used to attract hummingbirds?
That seems to be in their color spectrum. That seems to be one of their favorites. But they'll come to any flower, as you saw with those Solomon seals. I mean, those are basically kind of a yellowish green. Those little tiny little bell-shaped flowers that hang on a Solomon seal. How they manage to get attracted to that, I don't know. There's certainly no red involved by any means. So red's not absolutely important. Salvias that you can buy as a annual, usually you buy those as red, but you see them in purple and pinks and things too. And that doesn't seem to matter to the hummingbirds at all.
Okay.
Our marigolds the other day, they were kind of orange and yellow. So.
Yeah, I know you always see the feeders are always red, and the pre-made foods they sell are usually red, which avoid those.
Right.
And I've answered that question a few times too. Plain sugar, tap water is fine.
Right. Right. You don't want to get into any of those artificial sugars though.
Right.
Or honey. Those things would all be bad. So stick with the cane sugar.
Yeah. Let's see. Do butterflies bother hummingbirds?
I don't think so. I mean, they will utilize the same flowers for their nectar, but I've never seen them in a drag down fight or anything like that. Lately, they've been hitting my swamp milkweed and my butterfly weed.
Okay.
Both the hummingbirds and the monarchs. I don't see any major conflict there. My money's on the hummingbird.
Let's see. I don't know if you know this one. Does the hummingbird recognize the feeders by the smell of the sugar water or by the color of the feeder?
They're doing most of their hunting by eyesight. So okay. They have a very
probably more color.
Yeah, they have a very poor sense of smell, supposedly, just based on studies of the part of the brain, olfactory part of the brain. It's very, very small and undeveloped in most birds. Very, very few birds have much of a sense of smell. So, but I've had experiences where I know that the hummingbirds must have smelled something. One incident had to do with brushing teeth and a hummingbird showing up when it was nearly dark out.
Oh, wow.
I think they came for the sweet smell of the
toothpaste.
Crest.
Oh, is that funny?
And then another time we were, Melissa and I were hiking in Glacier National Park, and she had just applied some cherry blistex, which is not colorful, but it is very sweet smelling. And
sure.
Hummingbird just made a beeline right at her, almost to the point of startling her. That was before we knew that they would go in ears and nose. And
yeah.
Well, that was kind of startling. But so there's two instances where it seemed like they were attracted by smell, but supposedly they don't have a very good sense of smell.
All right. Well, because we are running over so much, this will be the last question here. Sorry if we didn't get to everyone's questions, but if you do have further questions about plants or attracting hummingbirds or anything, please feel free to send me an email. I will put my email address in the chat.
You can also put my email address in there if they want to, ask me specific hummingbird questions. I'm more than happy to answer questions. I get questions from birders I haven't seen in 15 years. I still get questions from them. Really doesn't matter.
So the last question, we've got another migration question here. So it's kind of a two-parter. Do the kids stay near mom after they leave the nest? Do they travel south as a family? And then the other question was, when they migrate, do they travel as a group or just individually?
They, I'm sure they don't travel as a family. Once those young birds do fledge, I doubt that they're being attended to by the mother at all. She's probably, if anything, she's probably thinking about developing a second nest. So, and then as far as flying as a group, they probably are all lifting off with the same kinds of conditions. So, I mean, they're all programmed to look for the same kinds of conditions to migrate in. So they're probably going to lift off at the same time, but that's not necessarily that they are migrating together. Just like any of our other warblers, a lot of our passerines like warblers, they're all, it's a mixed flock. It's not like they're all going up together. All the black-brained warblers decide today is the day or anything like that. They're mixed flocks, and they're all just migrating because they're all programmed to look for those right conditions.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for participating in our webinar today. We hope to see you back again next week. Remember, check out our YouTube channel where we've got all of our past webinars as well. This one will be posted, I say within a day. I usually have them up within a couple of hours. So, but thank you again so much. I think we are all very jazzed up about our hummingbird feeders. I'm going to go clean mine and change the water in it. And
if you learned anything today, that's probably the most important thing. We can poison our hummingbirds so easily with that bacteria. It's really a bad situation, and a lot of people leave them up, and that could go back to that Southern Illinois question. If your hummingbird nectar went bad in your feeder and they recognize that, that might be why they're not coming to the feeder too. So
yeah, exactly. So and clean them well. A couple of questions about natural cleaners. Quite honestly, bleach is not the devil.
Mm-hmm.
It's very good at killing germs and bacteria, and then it evaporates. So as long as you rinse it really well, let it air dry.
That's the air dry part, right? And so
yeah.
I didn't mention that, but yeah, I usually use just soapy water. But if you do use bleach, then 1 part per bleach per 10 parts water would be nice. You could use vinegar too, but the soap and water is readily available. It's right there at the sink usually.
Yeah, exactly.
It's easy enough to use, but the thing is triple rinse. Make sure you rinse things very thoroughly, and then let them air dry before you put nectar back in.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you, Dennis. We really appreciate you doing that with us, and we hope that we will be able to get you back maybe in the fall to talk about migration.
Sure, that'd be another fun topic.
Yeah. All
Thanks,
right.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for signing in today. It was great to have all these questions, and it's exciting to have this many people interested in hummingbirds.
So many people are interested in hummingbirds and nature. So it's always good to see everybody. So take care, everybody. We hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, so are they all signed out, or
They are slowly signing out. I'm going to go ahead and end it now. I was looking at the thank yous.
Okay.
In the chat, but
do we have anything to discuss, or
we'll talk about it later.